Hey, it's that time again where I talk about my game for exactly 7 minutes and 38 seconds to try and convince you that I've been productive this month. So, without any further ado, let's see what I've been up to. I've been putting off starting the UI or user interface for a while now. It just felt so daunting to me, and I've never had any real experience with them in Unity before. We got a very small glimpse at it last time when I implemented the timer, but it wasn't substantial enough to go into much detail. This month, or I guess these couple of months, I finally implemented a title screen, pause menu, scene transition effects, and even updated the visuals for the timer. It turns out, making UI isn't nearly as difficult as I had thought it was. Surprisingly, it was very intuitive, and I managed to figure it out rather quickly. I mean, just let the final product speak for itself. Moving on from the UI, I'm sure you've noticed a small graphical upgrade in terms of the player, background, and platforms. I remade all of my older assets to mostly fit my standards, however, I'm still iffy about the player animations. I've held off on making the other animations until I've solidified my choice of style for the player, but my standards increase with each passing devlog, which doesn't exactly help in terms of actually finishing the art. Eventually, I'll come up with a design that I'm proud of, but until then, I'll have to keep what I have and just suck it up. Not everything is going to be perfect, and that's something I really have to understand if I want to finish the game anytime soon. Last up on the recent additions is the various visual effects I added into the game. Some are more subtle, like the many camera effects such as bloom, chromatic aberration, camera shake, and the vignette, but some are much more evident, such as the particle effects for the fire and lava, as well as the dynamic shadows and lighting. These are by far my favorite additions, and it just makes my game look so much more alive and stylized. Adding all of these effects was also surprisingly simple, yet they added so much to the game. Alright, now that the basics have been covered, let's dive a little deeper into the creation and theory of the UI, and how easy it is to make great looking interfaces with minimal effort. So first off, what is a GUI really? Well, it stands for Graphical User Interface, and it's a series of visual components that help the player navigate and understand the game space. This can come in the form of a life bar, coin counter, level progression meter, anything that gives the player insight into the basic information they might need to know while playing your game. UI tends to fall into two categories, diegetic and non-diegetic. Diegetic UI, or just the act of being diegetic, means that the thing it's referring to actually exists in the game space and thus makes sense in the context of the world. The characters are aware of its existence, and may often even reference it in-game. Being non-diegetic is the opposite. The players are still able to see it, but the characters are completely unaware of its existence, and it isn't meant to play into the narrative of the game. A good way to understand diegesis is to think of the music in your game. If the characters in-game would be able to hear it, it's diegetic. If the player can hear it but not the actual characters, the music would be non-diegetic. All of the music and UI in my game are non-diegetic, so this isn't too relevant, but it's still a very interesting topic nonetheless, and could lead to some creative storytelling in your game. So how did I implement the UI in the first place? Well, let's take the pause menu as an example, and move from there. The UI consists of multiple different components, the main one being the canvas. Once you have a blank canvas in your game, you can add various other components onto that canvas, like panels, buttons, text, and even images. For the pause menu, I simply added a panel onto the canvas and made it slightly transparent. From there, I added the text and buttons onto the panel. To make the button animations, I simply changed the button background color and size whenever the player hovers their mouse over the button, something that Unity makes very easy with their animation component. From there, I copied the button a few times and renamed them. The actual programming part was very simple too. Unity buttons are able to call functions automatically from any script when they're pressed, so I simply made a new script for the pause menu functionality and made a few functions. One to resume the game, another to go to the menu, and lastly one more to quit the game. Once those functions are in the script, I go to the button's properties and choose the function I want to call whenever the button is pressed. Lastly, to activate and deactivate the pause menu in the same script, I disabled the pause menu at the start of the game and enabled it whenever the player presses the escape button. To actually freeze the game, I just set the timescale of the game to 0. And it's that simple. As mentioned before, the other main additions to the game were the visual effects. Similarly to the UI, I had thought that dynamic lighting was going to be tricky to get right, but I think I figured it out well enough to improve the look of my game rather substantially. All it really takes is changing the rendering pipeline and adding a new 2D light onto the scene. To cast shadows, simply add the shadow caster component onto the object you want to cast shadows. The particles were pretty easy to add as well, especially with Unity's particle system, a great system for making amazing looking particles in Unity. It provides so much customization, and you can get some really interesting looking effects. I've barely scratched the surface of particles, and I honestly can't wait to experiment more. To add them into your game, all I did was add the particle object onto the scene and play around with the various settings. The fire consists of 2 different particle systems, one for the smoke and one for the actual flame. Together, they make a pretty good fire effect, even without actual sprites. The camera shake effect isn't all that interesting, but for the sake of explaining everything, I used Cinemachine's built-in camera noise system, which is as simple as choosing a drop-down option. There were multiple different choices, but the option I chose was the 6D shake. Considering my game is only in 2 dimensions, I'm a little concerned as to where the extra 4 came from, but oh well. The other camera effects were all done using a post-process profile and a volume component on the main camera. Once the correct profile is added to the volume component, you can add the various effects you want pretty easily and see the live updates in the scene window. You can see the list of effects I used here and the difference it makes to the visuals. So, the burning question remains, what's next for this project? Well, I have until the end of April to finish the game, and all that really remains to be added is the music, sound, more playable levels, as well as the visuals. And it seems like a lot, but the only part that's going to take time is finally being satisfied with the animations for the character. Like I mentioned before, I'm going to have to settle on there if I ever want to finish this game during this century. Considering the music, I don't plan on having multiple songs for my game, so just a few hours in GarageBand should probably be good enough for an interesting result. Anyway, the game is updated on itch.io, so if you're interested in playing the very early stages of release, the link is once again in the description. So what's going to happen after I'm finished? I'd like to make one final video recapping all of my devlogs, as well as showcasing the final product as a proper send-off for my first completed game in Unity. It'd be really cool to see a montage of all the progress on the game up to its completion. As for the future, this hobby isn't going anywhere. I'm still going to be interested in making video games, and this certainly isn't the only one I'm going to make. I'm always coming up with wacky game ideas and cool characters, so who knows, maybe I'll be back to making videos on a new game. I do have an old Wii remote that I'd love to figure out how to use in Unity. Until then, however, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you at my next and final devlog for Project Midas.